Welcome everyone to Esri's Spatial Data webinar series. Today's webinar is Esri and Spatial AI, revealing powerful insights from geosocial data. This webinar will be recorded and shared with you. I am your host, Carissa Schrader, and it's my focus to get you, our listeners, quickly started using quality data sets. I'm so very pleased to share that we have special guests and Esri partners, Spatial AI, on our webinar to share more about geosocial data. With us, we have Leiden Faust, Spatial AI co-founder and CEO, and Lauren McGrath, Senior Director of Client Success. Today, we will learn how to power your ArcGIS with location-based social media data, now available in ArcGIS Marketplace. I'll be moderating today's webinar, so please add any questions to the chat and we'll save time to answer at the end. Please also be sure to download the handout provided for any additional information to get you started. Now let's get started with Spatial AI.
Thanks so much for the intro, Carissa, and thanks to everyone on the line for joining us today. My name is Lauren McGrath, as Carissa mentioned, and I'm our Senior Director of Client Success at Spatial. Before we jump into the meat of our content today, let's run through some of the key items that we'll cover. As a thank you for joining, we're giving you a freebie. Everyone loves something for free, which we'll go through on the next slide. Then we'll walk you through a little bit of background on us at Spatial AI, our data landscape and where Spatial fits into that landscape, and a little bit about our methodology, so how we collect and capture our data. From there, we'll arm you with some information on how to apply geosocial to a variety of different use cases. Those use cases will range from things like site selection to marketing and a handful in between. And then we'll walk through a step-by-step case study. And then lastly, we will showcase how you can easily access the data either through Esri and ArcGIS Marketplace directly or direct from Spatial AI. All right, so as a thank you for joining us today, the group here on the phone is the very first to see our new social mapping tool. And we're giving away 3 free site analyses as a thank you for joining our webinar. All you have to do is head over to spatial.ai/social-map and enter an address that you know well. So it could be your home or it could be a commercial location that you're thinking about doing a study on, and check out your social report. You'll have access to a handful of segments up front, and then you'll also have the opportunity to download a PDF report that has a lot more information. So I'd encourage you to download that, share it with colleagues, disseminate it throughout your organization, and also reach out to us with questions. Okay, let's jump in here. So there's one overarching question that we at Spatial seek to answer, and that is, how can we do a better job understanding what communities are like before we invest millions of dollars in developing them? We have platforms at our fingertips everywhere we go, on our mobile devices, using social media, and those platforms give us the power to not only understand, but make decisions about an area as if we are a local who lives in that area. All we have to do is capture that information and apply it to our problem. Let's rewind quickly for a story so you guys can understand a little bit about Spatial and why we even exist. So back in 2015, our CEO Leiden, who's joined us on the call today, was on a business trip in Nashville where he was actually studying as an ethnographer. Before he went to Nashville, he spent a lot of time researching the area, trying to look for places to live, whether they're Airbnb or VRBO type locations, so that he could really immerse himself into the culture of the city. On his first night in East Nashville, near his Airbnb, he was actually held up at gunpoint, a terrifying personal experience. And it also prompted him to think, with all of the technology and all of the data that I have at my disposal, why is it that we can't do a better job of understanding what communities are like? So out of that experience in 2016, Spatial was born. And today we use Leiden's personal experience to help businesses solve their commercial challenges. It's the same question, what is a community like, and should I put my store here, but just through a different lens as a business. Our data set officially launched in March of 2018. We are a team of engineers, data scientists, and industry experts based out of Cincinnati, Ohio, and we're venture-backed. Our investors are Sarah Ventures, M25, Future Shape, and Techstars. So let's explore the data landscape. Many of you on the phone likely know quite a bit about this data landscape. In fact, you might use census and psychographic data on a daily basis. The traditional data landscape has remained pretty consistent over the past several decades. And so I think it's important to understand the landscape that we sit inside of so that you have a framework for where geosocial data fits. Census data is a treasure trove of American demographics. The census, or even ACS, tell us a lot of basic information about where people live, or based on where they live, their age, income, education, ethnicity, et cetera. But there are some limitations to that data, as many of you likely know. So it's performed every 10 years by the US government and updated annually by ACS. But census data can be stagnant, meaning that it's dated, and it can be oversimplified. So similar demographics may not necessarily imply that two groups have similar needs, values, or motivations within that same demographic group. And then you also have the challenge of problematic demographic data within a given region that can produce unreliable assumptions about that area. Psychographic data takes us a step further. It layers a lot more detailed behavioral questions collected from survey sampling onto our census demographics. And then these data are projected onto areas around the country. It's a great way to learn more about the actual behaviors and motivations of people who live in an area. But again, there are limitations with it in its scale and accuracy because there are assumptions related to those projections. For example, Carissa and I might be similar in age, income, education, even ethnicity, but our interests likely vary quite a bit. So what's missing? Until now, there has really been no organic, self-contributed, real-time behavioral data set that is unique to every community. And that's where geosocial data fits. So why does this matter? At Spatial, we believe that using census and survey data alone misses a really critical piece of the consumer data landscape. And that would help us better understand what communities are like as a local. And that puzzle piece is human behavior. Missing that information can lead to a lot of problems. It might mean sales models that exhibit low accuracy and aren't actually predictive of success. It could look like investments in areas that are not accelerating, tenants that don't align with community interests and therefore turn over quickly and often, or even marketing dollars that are spent inefficiently in areas that don't make sense. Geosocial allows businesses to make decisions based on the true needs and desires of a community as told by the community itself through social media data.
Great, thanks, Lauren. Yeah, so I'm gonna walk you through, this is Leiden, by the way. I'm gonna walk you through what the data looks like and where it comes from. But at the core, when we started Spatial, our insight was that there's billions of people are talking on social media and no one was capturing those interests at a geographic level. And that's what we do with this data set. So we organized billions of posts from platforms like Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Flickr, and we organized them into 72 distinct patterns of human behavior segments. So none of these data sources are particularly powerful all alone, but when you look at all of them in context of the community, it results in a boots on the ground insight that only a local would know about that area. So are the people in this community interested in fashion? Are they interested in fitness? Are they foodies? An example of where we saw this firsthand. So near our old office, there was the quintessential revolving door retail space, turned over 3 big brands in 5 years. And no one could figure this space out. And then there was a local mom that knew that that exact sidewalk that open space was on was the epicenter for joggers in the neighborhood in Cincinnati. So in Cincinnati, we have a Flying Pig Marathon, really popular run, and especially in this neighborhood. So she opened up a Fleet Feet Sports franchise, and they've now expanded to 3 locations in the Cincinnati area, and that store is celebrating 7 years in business today. So what did she know that analytics teams and property developers didn't? She had an unfair advantage because she knew the local behaviors of that community, and ultimately, it's that insight that this data set captures. Okay, so how does this work? So people are posting at locations describing their interests. So our posts come from where that behavior occurs rather than where they live. So it's actually what they're doing there. We organize these public geotag posts into specific segments of behavior. I'm going to take you guys through one here in a second. Those segments are scored as percentiles, 0 to 100, and they can be measured across any block group in North America. And what you'll notice is that block group will often have multiple segments that show up, and that just really captures the multiple dimensions and character of neighborhoods. The scores can be used in the same way as you would use a demographic variable in Esri. You can use them for thematic mapping, analysis, regression models. We'll go through a few business use cases, but first I want to give you a deeper look into one of these segments. Okay, so we're going to pull open our taxonomy. So we have 72 different social segments on the taxonomy. You can see some here: bookish, dog lovers. So that's essentially how much people are talking about their dogs in a neighborhood. LGBTQ culture, popular one. I'll walk through Girl Squad. This paints a really vivid picture of the community. So this is essentially girls' night out activity in the area, and you can look for each one of these segments at the topics. So musicals, dinners with friends, karaoke, mom's night out, painting. And obviously this is delivered through Esri at a geographic level, specifically the blog group level. So you can see Miami here. You can see the hot places for girls' night out activity. A number of demographic characteristics. We also have time characteristics. So you can see that this is traditionally happens on Fridays and Saturdays, and this segment traditionally happens late at night. And this is probably the most powerful for property owners and retail. So each one of these segments has retail affinities. Where girls' night out is high, you'll often find cocktail bars, Italian restaurants, sushi restaurants, wine bars. You won't find parks. And then brand correlations, here are a few brands that tend to show up. It's really good for directionally showing what type of retail to put in an area. And generally property owners or retailers will use those retail correlations to find back into almost like a void analysis. So if a cocktail bar isn't showing up in an area where girls' night out is really high, you can think of it, that's a great opportunity to capture that crowd. Okay, I'll let Lauren walk you through what this looks like in Business Analyst.
Thanks, Lennon. Okay, so we thought it might be helpful, since many of you are very familiar with the Esri platforms, to see how the data actually looks in Business Analyst. And before I hit play here, I'll give you a little bit of background on what we actually did. So you'll see that we've dropped a half-mile radius ring around the Esri headquarters in Redlands, California, and I've gone ahead and mapped 2 different segments. The idea here is that we'd like to really underscore the fact that each neighborhood has very different behaviors, and they range. You can go from one block group to another, and there are distinct behavioral differences between those areas. So let's take a quick peek here. So while this renders, what we're doing here is looking at dog lovers first. Dog lovers are into all things dog related. They talk about things like fur babies, going for walks, puppies, dog fashion. They're hashtagging things like man's best friend. And what you'll see here around the headquarters is that dog lover behavior is extremely prevalent in the 90th percentile nationwide. The area around it, directly around it in other block groups, varies quite a bit, however, in its interest in dog lover behavior. And that's shown by the lighter colors of orange and yellow. So you've got things in the 16th percentile, et cetera, indicating that those areas are much less interested in dog behavior. Now we're going to switch over to Trendy Eats, which actually looks a lot different on the map. This segment is made up of people who talk about things like sushi, burritos, they're hashtagging phrases like "get in my belly." And what you'll see here is, like dog lovers, Trendy Eats is really high in the area in and around the Esri headquarters, but it also, in the surrounding block groups, is really strong. They seem to be foodies as well. So in those kind of adjoining block groups that you see right next to the Esri headquarters area. This is a really big difference between what we saw in the dog lover behavior, big contrast. Now, the facets of a community are sometimes best shown as a thematic map, but they can also be reported here like you're seeing at the PDF, where we measure each of 72 segments in every block group across America. This helps us uncover the fact that there are lots and lots of different micro behaviors in each community, and those behaviors make up the profile of all the people there. So I've mentioned a few times that no two communities are really alike. So what we've done here is a deeper analysis in Atlanta and Boston. Now, when you layer demographic and psychographic data with geosocial, we're adding a new dynamic of consumer behavior to our story about an area. And this helps analysts develop a much more complete understanding of a neighborhood and community. In Atlanta, we looked at Ponce City Market, and in Boston, we looked at the Cambridge Galleria. Now, what you see in the graph on the right is that the top psychographic or tapestry segment for both of these locations is metro renters. But when you dig in deeper, you can see that the micro behaviors for each of these locations derived by geosocial data actually differ quite a bit. Now, this lends us insight about how to best serve each of these communities. If you think back to my example about myself and Carissa, we might both be metro renters, but our geosocial segments that pop for each of us might be very different. Now, in Atlanta, what we saw is that the behaviors most prevalent are things like networking, dancing, live music, partying, and style. And conversely, Boston is more interested in things like gardening, relaxation, reflecting, reading, even working. And I think the key takeaway here is that together with demographics and psychographics, geosocial helps create a fully complete picture of an area. So we've described to you a little bit about how geosocial data works. Leiden now is going to introduce you to the ways that you can actually apply it to a variety of different business questions.
Great, thanks, Lauren. So number of different applications. We're going to show you a few. We've got a dedicated Esri page that will take you through use cases on each of these and tutorials, but we're going to walk through these 6 today. Okay, so I know a lot of people on this webinar are in the commercial real estate function, so we're going to walk through a site selection use case first. So really the first question you need to answer when using geosocial is, how do you choose the right segment for your brand? And there's really 3 approaches to this. So the first is logical connection. So if you're Lululemon, you're going to probably want to know which neighborhoods are talking about yoga. If you are Lowe's, you're going to want to know which neighborhoods are talking about DIY. If you're Lauren, you might want to know which neighborhoods are high in wine lover activity, for example. A second approach to this is portfolio analysis. So luckily, business analyst makes this really easy, and we're going to walk through an actual use case with a brand in the next slide. Third is regression analysis. So you can use these as variables in a current model that you have, or build a model in ArcGIS Pro Model Builder. And Lauren's going to walk you through that here at the end, but first we're going to walk through how to do a portfolio analysis. Okay, so we're going to use the brand Shinola based in Detroit. They're a high-end leather and accessories watch retailer, and they're growing really quickly. They have 32 locations now. So we don't work with Shinola. I'm just using them as example. So that means we don't have any revenue data for them. So in order to define which were their best performing stores, we use Yelp and Google check-ins as a proxy for success to measure across a subcategory of these stores. Using this method, we found that Ann Arbor, Chicago, Detroit, and Plano stores rose to the top. And in a portfolio analysis, what you're looking for is which geosocial segments show up across their portfolio. So as you can see here in these stores, these are their top performing stores using this method, but there is very little demographic consistency in the stores. But when you look at the geosocial data, you start to see some really clear patterns in the social content coming out of the neighborhoods with successful Shinola stores. So we see LGBTQ culture, girls' night out, book lovers, coffee lovers, they all rise to the top. And they're actually over 80th percentile. What that means is that for Shinola neighborhoods that perform well, those four have higher LGBTQ culture, Girl Squad, and bookish and coffee activity than 80% of all block groups in the area. So we're already kind of capturing a story here. So yeah, one thing I want to point out is how powerful this is. Shinola employees are probably all nod at these behaviors, that they represent their target consumer really well. I'll also point out coffee lovers here. Sometimes this confuses people. So this is a really clear food-related segment and drink-related segment. So why is it showing up for a retail concept? What's happening here is that coffee shops are bringing in the type of crowd that resonates with Shinola, and Shinola can capture that crowd. Okay, so now that we have the segments that are meaningful for the brand, we can use the custom variable feature in Esri to create a powerful map for Shinola by creating what we call a Shinola index, kind of like an index fund. Okay, so steps to do this are pretty easy. So you create a custom variable and essentially take those four that match Shinola and then average them out and divide that by 4. And what that gives you is across any block group an index of how closely it matches Shinola. Cool, so this is what it produces. So for any DMA that Shinola is going into now, they can look at a thematic map showing the neighborhoods that most closely match the neighborhoods that Shinolas have been successful in. That's something that would have taken months of boots on the ground ethnographic research, and we just did that in minutes. So you can take this to the next level when you're choosing your next location. So we're using the Suitability Analysis tool here in Business Analyst. And what we did is we looked at 5 different locations, potential open locations, if Shinola were going to move into the Cincinnati DMA. And we weighted it based on some basic variables here: population, household income, traffic count. But then we added the Shinola index, which, remember, captures which areas and neighborhoods that Shinola fits in really well. And we got a ranking of the top 5 areas based on the 5 potential areas. Now, what's interesting is that Shinola has actually moved into the Cincinnati DMA. It's actually north. You can't see it on the map, but it's a high-end retail area. And the area that they moved into actually ranked last in this analysis because it didn't really capture the typical Shinola community. And if you look at Shinola's Cincinnati store, it has the least amount of Google check-ins and the lowest reviews. So why is that? It's in a high-end retail area, but Shinola really captures a very different and urban crowd, and they kind of deviated from their typical strategy when they made that decision. But like I said, we just ran this in minutes, and just a minute of looking at geosocial data, we can really hone our decisions in and potentially not make a store decision like this. Okay, so leasing strategy. So you can think of this as the reverse of site selection. Our property owner and broker clients will often use this in a leasing strategy. So the question we're answering here is, what type of customer do you locate in an open space? Okay, so we've got a grocery anchored strip center with 2 open leases here in Montgomery Road in Cincinnati. And we wanted to find the right retail that fit the community. So the first step that we did is we took Esri market data and found the surplus leakage in the area, and it showed us directionally we should be looking at clothing and accessories or sports and hobby retail for the area. The next step was to get into who these people are so you can figure out what to put there. One of the things I love about the Tapestry data set, psychographic data set available through Esri, one of the things I love about the Tapestry data set and the Geosocial data set together is they tell stories about each other. And here's a really good example. So the InStyle segment is the top to #1 Tapestry segment for this area. It's essentially married couples, high income, young, and no kids. And what we see with the top geosocial interests is animal advocates and dog lovers is scoring off the charts in this area. So essentially, these people have no kids and a lot of money, and they're really interested in their animals. Great social insight. So at a 1-3-5 mile radius, there were no pet shops in this area. So our first recommendation here is obvious. So we recommend Pet Value, Petco, or PetSmart. The other recommendation we made, so handcrafted was really high in the area, as well as humanitarian, so people with a penchant for social good. So we recommend concepts for that area that match that, like Tom's, Patagonia, and 10,000 Villages. You know what we see people really excited about using the data for is the leasing agents will use that to speak to the retailer and just show, hey, you know, people are already really interested in talking about the concept that is relevant to your brand. And they'll use it as a bit of a marketing tool to get the right types of tenants into the space.
Awesome, thanks, Lyden. Those are great, great use cases. So we've mentioned that geosocial data can be used for a lot of different industries and scenarios, well beyond real estate. We've covered a couple of those real estate ideas so far. So let's take a look at other ways that geosocial data can work. I'll show you an example of marketing and strategy, in this case for Subway. So Subway did a study with geosocial data in Chicago, looking at the relationship between business hours or hours of operation and consumer behaviors that appear using geosocial data. And in that assessment, they found that late night behaviors surrounded several of their stores in the Chicago DMA, and that they might benefit from optimizing their hours strategy to accommodate those behaviors. Here, what I'm doing actually is just replicating a similar study with a new location in the Lincoln Park area of Chicago. What you can see on the map in yellow is that the late night leisure segment is present in the neighborhood where Subway is located. It scores almost in the 99th percentile, which is a really very high score as it's compared to the rest of the country. So it's higher than 99% of other block groups around the United States. And the other block groups in and around that location in Lincoln Park also score really highly for that behavior. What's not mapped is another analysis that we did in the background looking at party life in this area as well. And we found that party life also scored really highly in the 96th percentile. Both of those segments are found late at night and early in the morning. And you can see that in the graph at the bottom of the screen here. Late evening is when late night leisure is most present, as well as early in the morning, so probably in the hours between midnight and 2 or 3 a.m. That to me suggests that Subway's current hours for this store, which close between 10 and 11 p.m., depending on the day of the week, don't actually support the customer behaviors in that area. Now, similar Subway stores benefited by becoming 24-hour locations. They actually were able to increase revenues by 10% or more using geosocial as an insight. If I'm looking at this and I'm Subway, I would suggest to my team that we do the same thing with this Lincoln Park store, given that there's significant financial upside of making that sort of operational adjustment. Now, we just talked about one way to think about marketing with geosocial, but there's also ways to use it from an advertising standpoint. And I'd like to walk you through a quick study that we did for that as well. Now, in this study, we looked at 3 prospective locations in Miami for a new discount shoe store. Now, using a regression analysis that we did separately, we learned that one of our segments, Smart Chic, had a strong relationship with revenue for this particular shoe store brand. What we also found is that Smart Chic behavior presents really strongly in the block groups around each of the 3 prospective sites. It scores in the 80th percentile or above, and those areas are indicated on the map with green borders and the dark blue fill. So using this insight, knowing our relationship with Smart Chic and performance, we suggested that this brand optimize their launch strategy towards areas that have a prevalence of Smart Chic behavior. This strategy allows them to minimize ad spend waste and only communicate with consumers who are actually interested in their brand or product. So as an example, this brand would think about placing things like out-of-home ads, billboards and such, dropping mailers and delivering digital advertising only in the strongest areas with Smart Chic in their community. Okay, here's a fun one. This is a little bit more outside the box, thinking about the ways that we can use product merchandising, geosocial data to optimize our inventory and merchandising mix from a product merchandising standpoint. So in this study, we looked at over 400 pet stores nationwide, all around the United States. And what we found is that there was a strong relationship between our segment Praise and Worship and sales of an adult dog food line. In fact, where Praise and Worship scored really highly, sales were almost double that of other stores where Praise and Worship was low. So using that information, we're actually able to identify 35 additional stores that had a similar thumbprint as the ones that were scoring really highly. Praise and Worship scored high in these areas, similar to those high performing stores, the other ones that where the sales were really strong. So those 35 stores represent a missed opportunity, in our opinion. There's a place in those locations for potentially high store sales, and so we suggested that the brand actually optimize their inventory according to this finding. This is another strategy-based scenario where geosocial data can help result in improvement on the bottom line.
Okay, urban planning. So this is a pretty fun one. So Ford last year purchased Michigan Central Station. It's a pretty well-known abandoned train station in Detroit, and they purchased that in the Corktown district. And it's traditionally a really low income and abandoned district in Detroit. And Ford planned to move 5,000 Ford salaried workers into a traditionally low income area. So in the headlines, the Ford team mentioned that they wanted to amplify the current resilience of the community rather than displace the current community. So how do you do that? How do you develop retail for 2 communities that are that different? So when you look at the geodemographic profiles, these communities could not be any more different in their preferences. But when you looked at the social interest, there's a really interesting pattern that both these communities shared. So both communities talked a lot about networking and moving up the job ladder. Both communities love their rap music, and both communities love to talk about film. So there's 3 commonalities that these communities have. Now, you guys probably remember I was talking about the retail affinities that each segment has. So what we did is we looked at the retail affinities for networking, hip hop culture, and film lovers, and we found retail concepts that both of these communities would love. So things like cosmetic services, auto repair shops, barber shops, comfort food, gyms, and movie theaters were retail concepts that would not only would both communities love, but would actually bring those 2 communities together to mix in.
Okay, so we've shown you a broad array of scenarios where we can use geosocial data. Now what I'd like to do is dig in a little bit deeper and show you a step-by-step analysis that we did for a discount shoe store in Florida. We're going to focus on this one, on site selection for this particular case study. So what you have here is 2 locations in Florida, one in Jacksonville and one in Kissimmee. And you can see on the bottom of the screen that we've outlined demographic profiles for each of them. Now, if you compare them, you can see that those demographics are very, very similar. And that would lead us to believe, looking at demographics alone, that they might perform similarly well from a revenue standpoint. However, what we see when we look at revenues is that the sales numbers are very different. Site 1 is nearly double that of Site 2. This is a really common problem. Many of you on today's webinar have probably experienced it before, where demographics don't necessarily tell us the whole story about what's going on in an area. So what happened? And is there a way that we can use geosocial data to uncover what might have gone wrong with store number 2? What we did is we ran a correlation analysis in ArcGIS Pro, where we found that trend trackers and Smartsheet were the top geosocial variables correlated to sales. We also have some negative geosocial segments, which are kind of interesting anecdotally, but for the purposes of this study, from here forward, we'll focus mostly on Smartsheet as it was the segment most strongly correlated to positive performance. So here on the map, we see both visually and then numerically that store number 1 is located in an area where Smartsheet is particularly strong. The deep red color on the map indicates its strength. And we also see in the chart below, over here, that it scores in the 75th percentile, which means, again, that it's higher than 75% of block groups nationwide. Conversely, store 2 is surrounded by block groups that has a wide variety of Smartsheet behavior, some very strong, some very weak, and therefore when you drop the radius around this store, its overall score is much lower in the 39th percentile. So what we see here, wrapping that up, is that behavioral differences from geosocial point to revenue discrepancies between these 2 stores. Despite having demographics that looked virtually identical at first glance, there are micro behaviors that are the core differences between these geographies, and those micro behaviors directly impact the bottom line. So what we did is we took a backward look at 2 existing stores, and we wanted to find out what happened here. But how do we then use geosocial data to make better decisions going forward? What we're going to do now is use the knowledge that Smartsheet and sales are closely related for this brand and apply that to prioritizing a handful of new sites. So on the map here, we have 3 prospective sites. These are the same sites that we looked at in our marketing analysis in our other case studies. And all of these stores are in Miami. What you can see here is that we again look at demographics, and same as the first part of this study, we see that those demographic profiles are very similar. They're actually almost identical. So how do we prioritize which of these 3 sites is going to be best for the brand? Again, what we've done here is we've mapped Smartsheet with dark red being the strongest presence of the behavior, and then we've scored each site at a half-mile radius ring. Looking at this myself, I can rule out pretty quickly site 2 because its Smartsheet score is just in the 59th percentile. It's not super strong. It's not very weak, but it's also compared to its nearby prospective locations much lower. Now, sites 1 and 3 are pretty similar. They're in the 82nd and 85th percentile respectively. And so in order to narrow down to a single site, I'm also going to look at trend tracker behavior. If you'll recall, trend tracker behavior was the 2nd most highly correlated behavior to sales. And so given that site number 1 scores in the 51st percentile for trend tracker behavior and site number 3 is in the 75th, I think we can pretty confidently eliminate site number 1 from consideration. So collectively, When we consider demographics and geosocial together, we recommend Site 3 as the strongest prospective location for this shoe store brand. Now, once Site 3 opens, the brand can then use geosocial cues to communicate with prospective consumers and ensure a successful launch by delivering advertising to geographies where consumers are most likely present. This is likely reminiscent of our marketing analysis that we did previously, similar study here. Now, in the case study that we just went over, we showcased the data in maps that were rendered in Business Analyst, but sometimes you might want to share your findings in an easy to produce format or something that's easy to disseminate across your organization. And so here we show a sample of one way that you might consider displaying the data for a prospective site, where we're actually highlighting the key segments that are most important for this retail concept, the topics of discussion that create those segments, and then the retail concepts that best fit each of those segments. As a user of this data, Spatial.ai provides support in the form of data formatting, infographic templates like the one you see here, so that you can easily apply them to your data set when you download it as a feature service through the marketplace. So I'll turn it back to Leiden to discuss ways that you can actually access the data through Esri or direct through Spatial.ai.
Cool, thanks, Lauren. Okay, so how do you access the data? So we can deliver the data in a raw format, pre-processed across every block group in the US. We also offer Mexico and Canada, and the data is updated quarterly. We can also deliver that data in a stylized feature service through Esri. It makes it really easily, and it looks really visually beautiful. I'll show you in a second. We also have a dedicated Esri page that you can get on and look at tutorials. And I am proud to announce that we're going to offer this data on the Esri marketplace as well. So we know not everyone needs the whole US in every single segment. So we've created a subset of segments and split the data up into 8 different geographies. And for the participants of this webinar, we're going to be offering a free trial of that data through the marketplace. I'll show you what it looks like. Okay, so once you go to the Esri marketplace, you can pull up your data set. You can see it defaults to a thematic map. Since A is the first letter in the alphabet, artistic appreciation is the first segment that shows up. You can select and visualize any of these. Here we're selecting hops and brews. And each one of these block groups you can click and you can get a dynamic table that shows you the top scorers in the block groups. So this one looks like hops and brews is the top. So we show the dominant. And as you scroll down, you can also see a picture of that segment, a description that gives you a better idea of the segment, and then the topics that people are using that drive the segment, as well as those retail and restaurant affinities. So for the last thing, each one of these categories has a link directly off into the taxonomy where you can dive more into what makes that up, the demographics that it correlates with, and the retail concepts that it correlates with. So yeah, you pull it up to the marketplace, it's pretty immediately usable, and that'll be available soon. And yeah, don't forget, so thank you for sticking with us here to the end. If you go to spatial.ai/social-map, social-map, you can put an address in there and you can check out a PDF report of that address so you can get a better understanding of the data and kind of get your feet wet.
Awesome, thanks, Leiden. So this is Lauren again. Before we wrap up here and move over into our question and answer section, I just would like to say thank you to you guys for joining us. We hope that you found the content really useful and valuable to think about how geosocial can be applied not only to real estate challenges, but also marketing, urban planning, product merchandising, and other use cases outside of that. And we've found that this data runs the gamut in terms of the types of applications that people come up with for it every day. And so we're excited to help you explore those together with us. if you have any questions, please do feel free to reach out to us directly and we can talk about ways that they would work for you. So I'm going to jump over into some questions, and we'll take any that you haven't submitted yet. Please feel free to insert them into the question or chat box on the webinar, and we'll take those either now, or if we don't have time, we can also follow up via email.
Awesome. Thank you, Lauren and Leiden. That was such an informative session. And we did have some questions come through. Again, as Lauren had shared, the chat and questions are still open, so please feel free to drop them there. One of the first ones we did have is, how often is the data updated?
Yeah, this is Lauren. I can take that one. So our data set is updated quarterly, and it has a 2-year look back window. So you'll be able to refresh your data quarterly if necessary, although we do find often that updating either annually or biannually is sufficient enough for most types of analytics.
Good. It's good to know that the fresh data is always available, especially quarterly. That's really great to hear, particularly from the perspective of having clean and updated data at your fingertips. Additionally, another question, does the data come from where the people live or from where the behavior occurs?
Yeah, I can get that. So this comes from where the behavior occurs. So you can think about, this is where the Instagram post came from, the lat long. So those public posts come with a lat long. So it's really useful to capture what are those behaviors actually going on in the community, because those are the types of people that are actually there, and that could be your potential customer if you located there.
Oh, that's actually absolutely wonderful to hear, particularly as we start to think about, other types of data that we offer, perhaps like our movement data. Where are people at any certain time of the day, and what are they saying? How are they being social? Does it include the older generation, though? We did have a question come through. A listener said their mother is 70 plus on Facebook. Would they still be represented in this data?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we do get that one quite a bit, actually. So, it's an interesting phenomenon. I think social media has really disseminated across different age groups and demographic groups, especially over the last 5 years, 10 years or so. So what we see is that it's reported that 40% of people who are 65 or older actually use at least one form of social media. And then 69% of people ages 50 to 64 also use at least one form of social media. Now, we don't have the exact relationship between those stats and our data, but because we do capture data from so many different types of social platforms, we believe that our data set is going to follow those usage metrics and therefore represents the older demographic just as well as it would the younger demographic.
Oh, that's awesome to hear. We always want to make sure that we are capturing the total audience and not being excluding anyone. So it's great to hear that you do have, the stats to back it up, as well as the information that the users need to get started. Another question has to do with the global solution, and a number of listeners had typed in specific countries, one being Europe. Also, just wondering in general, is this only available in the US or are there global options for the data?
Sure. So currently we regularly process US, Canada, and Mexico. So all 3 of those are updated quarterly. And then for other countries, the data is out there and available. It's a matter of us having the demand from you guys for it, and then getting enough lead time to pull it together. Typically, we need about 45 days to open up a new country. So if you needed an area of Europe or APAC, we would be able to work with you, pull that data in, determine what it needs. So if it's a foreign speaking country, we might have to do some translation work around the data set, but definitely producible in that, we just need a little bit of lead time and we can send the data out, and it will also have those same segments that we contain in the US and any other country around the world.
Awesome. And then another question for GIS analysts, what is the key to choosing new data sets and deriving insights?
That's a good question. Yeah, I can take that. So I think, we've got new data sources coming online that are capturing human movement, human activity at the location level. I think the really successful GIS analysts of the future will be able to clearly understand the human element of that and almost act like a boots on the ground researcher. So they look at that data more than just numbers. They can actually think about the person behind that. So yeah, I think what I would recommend for deriving insight is, really three things. As a GIS analyst also has to sell it internally. One is to visualize at the moment that that data point was created, whether it's mobile movement data or geosocial data, what is that person actually doing there? And I think that will really help for the insight. The second thing is you're communicating internally. It's always helpful to, with stakeholders or managers, to connect it back to data sets that they are familiar with. So connecting a geosocial story back to the demographics of the area can make people feel more comfortable. And then the last thing I think that I'd recommend is to really get a good anecdote and tell that human story really well, because it can be great analysis, but analysis doesn't move very quickly by word of mouth. Great stories do, and great insights do move really quickly. So I would say visualize the moment that it happened, connect it back to familiar data sets, and make a great story.
I think it's great. We always talk about great storytelling here at Esri, and it seems that so many of us have stories to tell and also questions to ask. We have a number more questions on the list, and what I think might be best is if we take them offline and provide our listeners with almost a step-by-step walkthrough of some of these questions and answers so that they can feel more confident in getting started outside of the webinar. As a reminder, there is a handout for all of you to take with you today, as well as the geosocial data free site analysis for anyone looking to explore the data. But right now, I just want to thank you again, Leiden and Lauren, for joining us today. And for our listeners, we truly appreciate you tuning in and learning how to power your ArcGIS with spatial AI and geosocial data. We encourage you all to check out ArcGIS Marketplace and to follow the link provided for a free site analysis using geosocial data. We'll see you all soon for our next spatial data webinar, and until then, happy mapping.